Welcome to 2022, folks. We've rounded the corner. We're now in January and happy to have you along for this month's edition of HR Hot Topics. I'm your host, Jody Schaefer, and as always, I aim to make this the most informative 5 minutes of your month. And yes, we are still talking about COVID. We're going to talk about two different things this month. One, some updates from the CDC around quarantine, both duration of quarantine and who needs to quarantine and in what circumstances. So I'll walk you through that. And then I also want to give you an update, a kind of a takeoff from last month's episode, the large employer mandate for vaccinations that was stayed as of last month, meaning on pause while the courts took a look at it. And there's been some developments there too. So I want to bring you up to speed. So let's jump into the CDC. It's no surprise to most of us, right, that Omicron is here. It's becoming the more dominant strain. It used to be Delta, now it's the Omicron variant, and Omicron is incredibly contagious, much more contagious than the Delta variant was. And because of that, more and more people are contracting this variant of COVID, and it doesn't seem to be thwarted in any way by your vaccination status. Now, if you've been recently boosted, there is some degree of protection, but certainly the vaccine is not as effective against Omicron as it was against Delta. So we're seeing some breakthrough infections as well. All this means that it's going to hit your workforce, right? If it hasn't already, it's going to. And so what happens when that's the case, right? What are you supposed to do? So historically, the CDC said, if you're vaccinated, and vaccinated just meant that you got the full series of your shots, 2 shots for Pfizer and Moderna, 1 shot for Johnson & Johnson. If you were fully vaccinated or if you had had COVID in the previous 90 days, that even if you were in close contact with somebody that tested positive, you did not have to quarantine. Okay, so from an employer perspective, that was really important to know the vaccination status of your team and whether or not somebody had COVID and recovered. And the quarantine period, if you didn't fall into either of those two categories, was 10 days. In some instances, you could shorten it to 7, but CDC was recommending 10 days. So there have been some changes to that, and these changes just came out. The first is how long the quarantine period is. So it went from 10 days to 5 days. So 5 days in quarantine. And then at the end of that 5 days, if your symptoms are improving, assuming you tested positive, or if you were just simply in close contact and you were quarantining from a proactive point of view, and you remained asymptomatic, then at the end of 5 days, you can re-enter general public, including the workplace. But the recommendation is that you wear a mask for the next 5 days. So 5 days in quarantine plus 5 days of wearing a mask, and that allows you back into the workplace. Testing is optional. It's not required, and I think a big part of that is because some of the testing is not necessarily accurate depending on when you take the test. And also, let's be honest, folks, if you can find a test right now, buy 3 or 4 of them and just keep them in your closet because you're probably going to use them, right? It's really difficult to get your hands on an over-the-counter test, and it's just as difficult, I think, to get in and get an appointment and get a rapid test or a PCR from a healthcare professional. So testing is difficult to come by, so there's not a testing requirement here. There's a recommendation, but not a requirement. So that's the first big change, shortening of the quarantine period from 10 days to 5 plus 5 with a mask. Now, the next change is who has to quarantine. So I'm going to read this because it is a slight change. So who has to quarantine? If you have received vaccinations, either the 2-shot series of Moderna and Moderna and Pfizer, or the 1-shot series of Johnson & Johnson, that alone doesn't necessarily exempt you from quarantine anymore. So now the CDC is saying if it's been more than 6 months since you got the 2-shot series, or if it's been more than 2 months since you got the Johnson & Johnson shot, and you've not gotten a booster vaccine, then you should also now be quarantining if exposed, okay, to somebody that tests positive for COVID. So that booster component and the timing of your vaccines is now factoring in where it didn't before. And if you've recovered from COVID in the prior 90 days, then you're still right in the category with those who have received the booster or have completed their vaccination series within 6 months or within 2 months for J&J, and you do not have to quarantine. So a distinction there on the vaccination. It's not an automatic granting of, get out of jail free on the quarantine side anymore. It really depends on how long ago you got that vaccination and whether or not you got a booster. So for those that don't have to quarantine, again, let me just be really clear. If you have received the booster for your vaccine, then you don't have to quarantine if you were exposed. This is assuming you're asymptomatic, right? And assuming that you've not tested positive yourself. Or if you've had and recovered from COVID in the prior 90 days, you don't have to quarantine anymore. But if you do have to quarantine, then like I said, it's 5 days plus 5 days of wearing a mask. And if you can get tested, if tests are available, it's a good idea. It's recommended that you test on day 5 if you can find a test. If you are unable to quarantine, and so there are some industries, I'm thinking specifically about healthcare, where staffing shortages may be such that having somebody quarantine just isn't feasible, then the recommendation is that you wear a mask for 10 days if you were exposed. So I'm going to put links to this. Like I said, there are a lot of nuances here. The other nuance that I'll just point out is that previously under CDC guidance, you had to quarantine if you had close contact with somebody that tested positive. And close contact, as we may recall, was within 6 feet for more than 15 minutes cumulative over a 24-hour period. The new guidance doesn't use the word close contact, or doesn't, I guess, limit that to close contact. The new guidance says exposed, if you were exposed to. And I just want to read on the CDC website, the definition of exposure is very vague. It says if you've had contact with somebody who's been infected with COVID in a way that increases the likelihood of getting infected with the virus. So it's a judgment call. So the point here is that it's broadened, right? So you've got that coupled with how contagious this Omicron variant is, coupled with the fact that people are still trying to live their lives, most of them, right? Your employees out in the general public, maybe they have kids in the school system. The likelihood that they are exposed to somebody who tests positive for COVID is going to increase. And so you need to know not only their vaccination status, but you also need to know whether or not they've received the booster to determine whether they can be out for quarantine. And if so, right, it's 5 days rather than 10, and then wearing the mask for the next 5. So I'll put links to all of this in the email message so you can dive in. There are some specific rules that OSHA has put out for congregant living and K-12 schools and healthcare professionals. And so this guidance that I've just referenced is general guidance. There's more specific guidance for those categories. I'll link to that too. The next thing I want to just hit on here before we end, as I said in the intro for this episode in December, I talked about kind of the current status of some of the vaccine mandates that were put out there by OSHA and by CMS. And the OSHA mandate for large employers, those with 100 employees or more, as of the December episode was stayed, meaning it was on pause while the courts reviewed. Well, on December 17th, the Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit Court, which is the one that was hearing, right, all of those cases got combined and the Sixth Circuit was taking a look at that. They lifted the stay and they said that OSHA could continue forward with this mandate. So that means that if you're a large employer, the rules are back on for you. Now, OSHA did push some of these compliance deadlines out a bit. So now the new compliance deadline is January 10th. For the vaccination piece, and then February 9th for the testing requirements. Right now, right, employers should be pulling together the roster of who is vaccinated and then deciding how you're going to keep that information, and then deciding on the testing piece too. Remember, the mandate is that they are vaccinated. As an employer, you could choose to offer an option that allows unvaccinated staff to test weekly instead, but that was the employer choice. And as I said, testing is really hard to come by. So as of now, that is back on. Now, it's important to note that immediately following this, there were challenges that were issued to the Supreme Court, and Justice Brett Kavanaugh will review and make a decision on those applications and whether or not to grant a hearing to that. And whether a stay will be imposed again while Supreme Court takes a look at it. Right now, we don't know. We're just waiting to see. So we're just, if you're a large employer, you're proceeding as though this is a go until we hear from the Supreme Court. One final note here. I know I'm running a bit long, but this is important. My email server is down. It has been down since the 26th of December. I'm able to send messages, but I'm not able to receive emails in my inbox. Now, I've got my IT team working on it, but it's kind of this convoluted process, and I'm hopeful that it'll be resolved before this video even goes out to you. But I just wanted to put that out there. If you have sent me an email from the 26th of December until now, and you've not heard back from me, it's because I've not received it. Some of you are getting bounce back messages to let you know. Others are not. I promise I'm not ignoring you. I have no idea who's trying to contact me via email. So I would encourage you, if you need me, reach out to me over the phone. It's always the best way to grab me. 517-974-8033 is my cell phone number. I'll have Will put it on the bottom of the screen here. But hopefully all this is resolved before the video goes out. But if not, I'm not ignoring you. I'm just having technical difficulties. So way to start the new year out with a bang, right? So on that note, folks, I'll leave you. I'll be with you again in February, and we'll see, what other changes are to be shared at that point.